I'm Michael Goldman. Welcome to another installment of Studio Daily's podcasts from the Frontline series, where we regularly talk with filmmakers from various disciplines about their work on current major feature films. And this month, our guest is cinematographer Rodrigo Prieto, ASC AMC, who joins us to discuss the visual achievements seen in Martin Scorsese's 3 hour epic gangster drama, The Irishman. The film, now garnering lots of awards buzz, has gained a lot of attention for the landmark digital effects work used to apply the so called de aging process to lead actors Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci, as it tells the multi decade story of a mafia hitman who the movie theorizes may have been responsible for killing the legendary labor leader Jimmy Hoffa. But as Prieto discusses, there were reams of additional visual challenges and complex aesthetic decisions and techniques applied to the imagery, work that has Prieto in the conversation as a major player this award season. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Rodrigo, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Michael.
And I thought just to get going, for those who haven't seen the movie yet, and I hope that they see it soon, documents much of the life and times of a real historical character played by Robert De Niro in a, I guess, theorized story about what his role might have been based on a book in the disappearance and purported murder of the former labor union leader Jimmy Hoffa, who's played by Al Pacino. And it's about 3 hours, and there's some people who've kind of, I guess, speculated it's kind of Martin Scorsese's homage and maybe even his farewell to the gangster genre that he loves and, has portrayed so successfully over the years. It also has a lot of the cutting edge technical work, that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And it's had an unusual release into the world of Netflix and all that. Given all of those factors going into the movie, Rodrigo, did you kind of feel a special responsibility going into the project? That this was not another ordinary dramatic gangster film. It would be a major event in Marty's career. Or were you guys just hooking up to make another cool movie and you didn't really think about all that other stuff?
Well, to tell you the truth, it's always a big responsibility, whatever project you're doing, but certainly when you're making a movie for Martin Scorsese and with this subject matter that he's so knowledgeable about, and as you say, has done classic and incredible movies on these sort of themes. And for me, I grew up and started my career and got married and had my kids in Mexico and immigrated here to the United States. And for me to be the chosen one to do this movie, it's quite an honor, but also, as you say, a big responsibility. But I frankly, I didn't really think of that when we started talking about the project. I was more, I guess, into trying to figure out the logistics of the whole thing, of the visual effects, of how to portray the different eras. All this was a huge challenge anyway, so I kind of dove into that. But also, we'd just done Silence with Scorsese, which that really did feel like a huge thing for Scorsese as well, as a very important movie for him spiritually, emotionally, and historically, and in his also in all his filmography. So I'd already been through that experience of making a movie that for Scorsese was very important, and really enjoyed the experience enormously. So this was another one like that in a way, and so I dove right in and really loved every minute of it.
Of course, a lot of the attention or the press coverage, has been about the visual effects breakthroughs, the de aging effect on the lead actors for certain sequences and all that, and we'll talk about all that shortly. But I thought just up front, maybe from you the background story and sort of how and why you got lured into the challenge. You've done a couple films with Marty, as you just alluded to, but at the same time, he's proposing an epic where you travel through the lives and played by actors, brilliant as they are, they can't change their faces like elastic to be younger or older. So there was all these technical challenges that were going to be layered on top, and then it's a period piece through multiple decades and all that kind of stuff. So when Marty first came to you, what was the mission statement, and what were some of your concerns or challenges that you hadn't a clear vision of how you were going to solve for some of these issues?
Well, yes, I think one of the first things that we talked about was the notion that the movie is about memory and about time and about the point of view of this particular person on all these events. And so we tried to figure out a way of making it subjective to Frank Sheeran, who's the character played by De Niro, and also how to make the audience have that feeling of the passage of time and of our own memories of our own lives, because in the end, I think that's what we all look for as an audience when we're seeing a movie or any piece of art for that matter. We're trying to see ourselves and find how our soul is in any way connected to that piece of art. Now, I think a huge challenge here is that the character of Frank Sheeran, just as so many of Scorsese's characters in his movies, is a person that you could easily condemn and not even want to give him the light of day. A murderer, a person who kills for a living and feels no remorse, really. So that's a huge challenge. Just to carry a whole movie from that character's point of view. But I think that's what's amazing of the film. So the first challenge was that how to portray time, and then certainly the first discussions were about how we were going to do the de-aging and the visual effects part of it. One of the considerations was we wanted to shoot the movie on film negative, on motion picture film, and but the way these visual effects were going to be made to what they call the de-aging of the actors required a special camera rig that we can talk about if you want, but this required 3 cameras for each angle synchronized, with the shutters synchronized to capture depth, for the information for the computers to make the faces, the younger faces, have the exact performance that the actors are doing. So in any case, that had to be shot with digital cameras, and that ended up being roughly half the movie. So since we wanted this feeling of memory, that's one of the reasons we wanted to shoot on film negative, because we felt that film has a little bit more of that feeling of course, of the way we remember our lives, not only in home movies or anything like that, but just it doesn't feel so present, as digital cameras feel. They feel very immediate. We wanted a feeling more of the memory of the past. So anyway, these were our first discussions, were what to do with digital or film and how to portray this passage of time.
And yeah, and I do want to get into more detail on, I guess, the three headed monsters, what they're calling the camera rig that you're referencing. But before that, I did have one more question about the aesthetic. Obviously, as we all know, Marty has made some of the most legendary gangster films ever made. Goodfellas, Casino, The Departed, Gangs of New York, Mean Streets, and other period work may not have been gangster film, but cover were epic in a period like Raging Bull and all that kind of different stuff.
Yes.
But on all those different films, he previously collaborated with the late Michael Ballhaus,
Yes.
Bob Richardson, and one or two others. Was there any need or desire or helpfulness to going back to reference any of his earlier work, or because this was a more of an epic story, a character study of the guy's entire life and not just one adventure or one heist, something like that? Was it meant to be aesthetically, visually, lighting wise, all that, a much different creature anyway than those kinds of films?
Yes, we did not reference any of his previous work, and for this one, he had a very specific way that he wanted us to film Frank Sheeran's vision or his ways. You know, everything that had to do with Frank Sheeran. Scorsese talked about filming it. The word he used was like clockwork. He wanted it to feel almost anonymous. That's another word I remember he used in the sense that he didn't want the camera to behave in any spectacular manner. He wanted the camera to be repetitive in the type of framing and type of camera movement, simple. For example, every time we shoot a facade, it would be completely frontal. Or many of his killings, the camera simply pans with him as he comes down one street and sees the person he's going to kill. Boom, he kills him, and he just walks away. Or the camera's just static, and on a wide shot, and we see the killing. So he didn't want to stylize the murders, or in fact any of the scenes with Frank Sheeran, in this sense that Sheeran himself did not approach his work in any fancy way. You know, it was routine, and it was something that he just had to get ready for, and there was a method to it. So that's the way we approach the camera work. There are moments where the camera flies and moves, has big moves, but those are in scenes that are not involving Frank Sheeran. Say, for example, there's a moment where we go to Anastasia's killing in the barber shop, which is not literally connected to Sheeran. It's very tangentially connected to a story and more to Russell Buffalino. That's a big Steadicam move that starts in the barbershop, follows a bodyguard into a hallway, and then the other killers come in, and then we end up in some flowers. And that, in fact, was we stitched together the barbershop that we built on stage in a studio with a hallway in an actual hotel. So it was a tricky thing to make look like a seamless move. But there were moments like that where the camera behaves more more is more kinetic, but not with Frank Sheeran. So that was one of the considerations. And then the other was that Marty wanted to have the present for us was the journey towards Detroit, and in fact the murder itself of Hoffa. But he wanted the past to have some sort of treated color or something that would give you the past. He also mentioned to me at some point that he had imagined a sense of home movies, but he did not want it to look like a home movie with the handheld, grainy feel. So that's why I started looking into still photography, amateur still photography, as a reference, because we all have a memory of the photographs of our families, even of ourselves as children, that were taken with different emulsions. And I decided to give the 50s the look of Kodachrome. That was a very popular emulsion at that time, and it kept being used for many years, many decades after, but it feels to me like the 50s were particularly Kodachrome to me. Then, even though the 60s Kodachrome was still very much in fashion, but I felt that Ektachrome was a more modern emulsion that had a different color palette, a different way of reproducing colors. So we created a look of Ektachrome for the 60s. And then the 70s are the beginning, the first half of the 70s have a relatively normal feel to them because it's a present in terms of color. It's a normal color reproduction, let's say. But then after Hoffa's death, after his murder, I drained the color from the image and just emulated a process of printing for film, for motion picture films, called ENR. And that process that was developed in Rome, the silver is retained on the print, and the result is a higher contrast image with less color saturation. So we created what's called a lookup table, as we had done for Kodachrome and Ektachrome, but in this case, we created a lookup table for ENR. And so the end of his life is drained of color. To me, it seemed that the murder of Hoffa was practically the end of their lives. Everybody, it all kind of ended there. They kept on living, but it was a very different life from then on. So anyway, that was sort of the way I thought I could represent visually this passage of time, but also this sense of memory through the images. And I just remembered one thing that I personally referenced, but it was not something that Scorsese asked me to do. But the whole scene in the Latin Casino, which is where the Frank Sheeran's appreciation night occurs, it's a very long scene where they're giving this recognition to Frank Sheeran, and all the mafiosos are there, and Hoffa is the one giving a speech, and he gives him a watch, and all these things. And it's a scene that has many layers, emotional layers, and it's a celebration, but at the same time, very dark things are happening in the background, and it's lurking there. This danger, this threat, where Hoffa has to conform to what the mafia wants him to do. But he insists on staying with the union and all these things. And Frank Sheeran is caught in the middle of all of it. So it was a scene that I was really scared of. I was worried of how to make a scene that had these elements visually, that had this sense of celebration and of beauty, but at the same time of threat. So I was inspired in a scene in a ballroom, a very short scene in the movie Network that Owen Roizman shot, and I saw the scene. My daughter was actually looking at the movie, and I was passing by in the living room, and I was like, "Oh, look at that! They used red lampshades on the tables," and I thought, of course, that's a way of giving the scene a red color, to the light, reminiscent of many of Scorsese's movies, where that has been for me a motif that I've seen in some of his movies, where the red light is either in clubs or especially the scene where they're opening the trunk of a car, and they have this body there in Goodfellas, and the person is still alive, and they have to kill him, and they shoot him, and all this, and it's all lit with the stoplights of the car, so it has this red color to it. I remember when I saw that scene originally in the cinema, I was very struck by the potency of this color of the light, and how it made sense, because it was the car was emanating that light, so it worked very well. So inspired on that, I thought I could use that color for that scene. So indeed, I don't think I ever even mentioned this to Scorsese particularly, but yes, I thought that I would give that whole scene this red color, in a big part inspired on his own movies.
Yeah, and a lot of what you're describing is part of the reason why I viewed the movie pretty cleverly. Although we spend a lot of time, and understandably so, on the technical achievements, it was pretty kind of classic, kind of straightforward, subtle kind of a shooting approach. At least when the lead character, Sheeran, played by De Niro, is on the screen. I mean, I guess there are crane shots and things, like when there's a flamboyant gangster
That's right.
introduced, Crazy Joe Gallo, I think they called him,
Yes.
stuff like that. But I think creatively, the ability to match up your camera techniques and methodologies with the fact that he's trying to tell a human story about real people. They may be on their way to commit one of the most notorious murders in history, but they still have to stop for cigarette breaks and to get food, and they're thirsty, and who's going to drive, you know.
Yes, exactly.
And to have a parallel balance where the shooting matches up to that, I would imagine is an enormously complicated thing to figure out.
Yeah, for sure. It is. It is, and the logistics of it all was tremendous. And it would seem we had a luxurious schedule, but it was certainly not. We shot for 108 days, which is a lot of days, but we had more than 300 scenes and many different locations and sets. We had to build a lot on the studio simply because of that, just to be able to shoot the hotel in Miami and shoot the hotel in Washington and then shoot the restaurant in the Howard Johnson's hotel. To be able to shoot all these scenes, we literally only had half a day for each section. So we had to move quickly, and just figuring all that out was a huge challenge from a technical and logistical standpoint. But even, for example, there's a lot of scenes in cars. There's many journeys, and especially the whole journey to Detroit, and then once they're in Detroit, the whole section when they're driving in the red car, they go pick Hoffa up and they drive up to the house, and then Hoffa's killed. All these travels, I realized that we had no real time to achieve it all. It's very time consuming to film cars actually on this road, and car interiors, especially in a period movie, because you have to close down a road, you have to put all period cars, extras that are dressed in period, and then shoot a piece, and then stop, open up the road, let cross, et cetera, et cetera. So I realized we did not have that time in the schedule. So we created this way of shooting in a studio as well. And I lit it with huge panels that are basically big monitors, as if they were huge televisions that were about 11 feet tall by 16 feet long. Had three of those. And we use that as a background, so it's what you see behind them, sort of like they used to do rear screen projection in movies. In this case, there were monitors, they were basically screens. And around the car, I had these other huge screens that were creating the lighting. So it becomes interactive. So if you see, for example, in their glasses, that they're wearing dark glasses, you see the reflection of these big monitors, and you might see a tree passing in the reflection, and then you actually see the tree or the car, whatever it may be, in the background. So it looks pretty realistic, perhaps not 100% realistic, but at least we were able to do it. So these were the kinds of challenges that we faced. I felt that every day on this movie was a final exam for me, and everything that I've learned so far in my career, I had to apply everything, all my experience. And like in every movie, there's always things, unexpected things that happen with the weather, with all sorts of things, and you have to come up with a solution. That's just part of our job as cinematographers. We always do that, or anybody in filmmaking. But this movie particularly, I felt that every day was a huge challenge, and you just had to, figure it out.
And speaking of learning new stuff, if I understood right, the de aging process and it was going to be achieved so successfully was something that was pulled off in close collaboration with ILM and their wonderful visual effects supervisor Pablo Hellman,
Yeah,
and a big team, and all that kind of stuff. And you referenced the three-headed monster, but
yeah,
at the root of everything, what fascinated me was you have three of the greatest actors of all time in De Niro, and Pacino and Pesci,
yeah.
and they are the ages that they are, but they're still great actors. You want to get their performances. How
Yeah.
did the two mesh? Where the technical requirements of Pablo and his team could be met, but at the same time not take you off of creatively making sure you capture the best performances from these guys, regardless of what age they'll end up as, in the final shot.
Uh, for me, always part of what I think is important, and one of the things that I think is very important in my job is to make myself and the paraphernalia around cinematography as unobtrusive as possible, because it can become a hindrance, I do think, when due to the camera or the lighting, whatever, you're telling the actors, this is your mark, you have to be right there, be careful not to block your light, et cetera, et cetera. And then as a cinematographer, you go in and you're measuring the light, and it can become a nuisance, I think, for the actors. Of course, they're all professionals and they know how this works, but I try to be as invisible as possible. But when you have a camera that requires two other witness cameras, that's what they're called, right next to them. And these witness cameras had little infrared lights around the lenses and all the cables and monitors. And, it became kind of a big thing for each camera. But not only that, we shot, I think, almost every dialogue scene with two cameras, two angles simultaneously. So we were shooting over each character's shoulder onto each other. So that's two angles, but that would require six cameras, meaning the two main cameras with each one of them with two witness cameras. So that was six cameras. And sometimes we did two or three scenes where we simultaneously would do a two shot where we saw both actors in one angle and then the close-ups on the two other angles. So that meant 9 cameras. So that could be with 9 focus pullers, so that was a big crew, a lot of cameras. Still, as much as possible, I tried to make it unobtrusive, and we built the rigs as lightweight as we could, so that we could put these three-headed monsters, as we call them, on any type of remote head or any type of regular camera head, so that we could function as a normal movie, and not have this become a factor. Because also the reason that we created this rig is that Scorsese did not want his actors to have tracking marks on their faces or helmets with little cameras on the helmets or any of this sort of thing. He wanted them to act with each other as they normally would. And so that's why we had to create this special technology that Pablo designed. And I was involved in making the rigs so that they would function, all this. But also lighting wise, it was pretty challenging to shoot these simultaneous angles, because one camera is seeing one actor and you light for that actor's face and the background, and you try to give it depth and give it a mood, but then when there's another camera looking in the exact opposite direction, the lighting that might look and function very well for one angle just creates problems for the other angle. So I had to figure out techniques to make both angles have the same mood, the same drama, the same depth, and that became a pretty big challenge to me. But I felt it was important. It was well worth it, because then the actors, their energy, maybe it took longer to prepare, to light for all those angles simultaneously. But once it was ready, they would do the scene and then it was done. We didn't have to now go back to the reverse angle, and their energy had to be put to 100%. They had to give their energy to 100% from the beginning, and they didn't, so then it took less time for them actually to do the scene. So I think that was effective. But it was challenging, but I think well worth it. And for me, just simply watching these performances as they unfolded was spectacular and very exciting.
For those of us who follow this kind of stuff, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it sounds like you're saying that although you have to develop some new stuff and it's very complicated technically with creating infrared maps of actors' faces for the visual effects team and all this kind of thing. On the one hand, on the other hand, for the actor and for the creator, the people only interested in the story, it seems like it's almost a boon where we're not making them wear funny markers and clothes and helmets and hoods and lights and all this kind of stuff. So if you're De Niro or Pacino, you just do what you always have done. You don't need special training or anything like that. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, maybe the first moment they would see the three-headed monster, it'd be a little bit of a surprise. They'd be, taken aback with all, looking at it. But that was an instant. Then it was forgotten. Then they just did what they did normally, and the camera moved where they moved, and exactly, it didn't feel to them really any different to shooting just with a regular film camera. So and the scenes that did not require visual effects, we shot on film with film negative, and and then we blended it all to make the digital match the things we shot on film.
Getting back for a second to the three-headed monster, just so I make sure I understand. If I read it right, you guys were using the red helium, the 8K camera, as the primary camera in the rig, and Arri Alexa minis, I guess, as the witness cameras. Is that how it went down?
That's correct. That's correct. And I tested different digital cameras to decide which one would be our main one, or the central one, the one that's actually capturing the image that ends up in the movie. And one big part of my testing was seeing how these lookup tables that I described before, the ectochrome, the Kodachrome, the ENR, all these looks are created by color scientists that map the different colors to so that the end result would look like a Kodachrome print. You see, so let's say the green of a lawn looks a very particular shade of green when it's photographed with a Kodachrome, right? But our film negative is not Kodachrome, so we had to map the colors to look like that in the end result. So now I had to find a camera that would reproduce those colors the same as our film negative. You know, when we applied the lookup tables, and I found that the red helium was the one that best reproduced these colors. That's the reason I chose that camera, because I compared it to other camera systems. It doesn't make them better or worse at all. It just happened that it was easier for these particular lookup tables that we were creating. It was easier to reproduce them on the red helium. So that's why I chose that camera. Now, the witness cameras, this is the thing. They had these three cameras had to move in unison so that the witness cameras would capture the performance of the actor's face, so that all that information was fed into the computer, and then they could create the CGI face. But the lighting that I created on the set was captured by the main camera, but the witness cameras had to not be encumbered in the information they were gathering by the lighting. Let's say I could have lit a scene in total silhouette, for example, really very little detail on the face, but Pablo Hellman needed all this detail. So what they did is that these cameras were the filters that digital cameras have that block infrared light, which is a wavelength of light that exists but we don't see with our eyes. So cameras have filters that block that light. So those filters were taken out of those cameras, of the minis, the Alexa Mini witness cameras. And then in front of the lens, we'd put an additional filter that would actually block out the wavelengths of visible light, so that the only light coming in through the lens was infrared. And then around the lenses, we had infrared lighting, LED lights around the lenses that would project infrared light onto the actor's face that would only be read by the witness cameras. So in a sense, these cameras were seeing a completely flatly lit, frontally lit face. So they had all the information of every nuance of what the face was doing. But the main central camera would not capture that infrared light because it had a filter to block the infrared light. It sounds perhaps a little confusing, but the end result was that when you saw the monitors, you saw the main angle and it looked regular with my own lighting. But when you saw the monitors of the infrared witness cameras, you saw a completely flat lit face. So that was, I thought, pretty clever. And that's a way that Pablo was able to have all the information of the performances without all these tracking marks and all these things.
And was your lensing choice, on the helium camera, exactly what you were using on the film cameras, or did it have to be, tailored specifically for the effect that you were going through, for that particular sequence, or was that, your primary camera was not impacted by what you had to do with the witness cameras?
Yes, exactly. The main camera was not impacted at all by what the witness cameras were doing, except for the fact that it had to be in this rig that had to have these other cameras attached to it. That was the only thing. But I used the same lenses, which were Cooke Panchro Classics. on the film cameras and on the red helium, and we maintain the same field of view. So we are actually cropping the sensor of the red helium to match the size of the film, the aperture in the film cameras, and so yes, the idea was to be filming with the red helium as if it were a film camera, basically, with the same lens that we used. And so I chose Cook Pancro Classics because I didn't want a very, let's say, crisp, modern look, but I wasn't going either for something that's pretty much in vogue these days, where you use lenses that are cause distortion and a lot of flaring and this sort of thing. I felt that would have been also an extra stylization that did not work particularly for Frank Sheeran, for the reasons we discussed earlier. So I wanted some lenses that had a little bit of a vintage feel to them, but not overtly so. I wanted the image to be fairly, let's say, normal, without any particular distortion. So that was another consideration in choosing the lenses.
For lensing, you did not have to go to different choices depending on the time period Ed was in or the age, whether he was 40 or whether he was 75. Your basic lensing package was what you shot the whole movie with?
Yes, yes. In this case, I decided to make the changes of the passage of time only through the lookup tables, through the color. But indeed, in other movies in the past, I have been switching types of lenses or even aspect ratios, or I've done other types of things. Even on Wolf of Wall Street, I did that. I used anamorphic lenses for a section of the movie and spherical lenses for another section of the movie, and that sort of thing. In this case, I kept the same package of lenses.
And when you shot film, what film stock and about what percentage of the movie was shot film as opposed to digital?
It was almost exactly 50-50. I believe it was about 50.7% on film negative, and the rest was digital. So yeah, it turned out to be literally half and half. And I used Kodak 5219. That's 500 ASA for all the night scenes and night interiors, everything that was lit with tungsten. And then I used 250 daylight, which is 5207 Kodak, for everything that was daylight balanced, everything that I lit with daylight or day exteriors. So those were the two film stocks, and I did push the film stocks one stop towards the end. After Hoffa's death, I pushed the stock to add more grain to the image, and also that creates a little more contrast, which was enhanced with the lookup table. But this extra grain just gave it a little more texture to that whole section towards the end. I just wanted the image to vibrate a little more, and that's what grain gives you. And so that's why I pushed the stock for that part.
And when you talk about, pushing the stock, doing the de-aging or the passage of time, through the different lookup tables, the Kodachrome, the Ektachrome, the fact that you have half digital, you have half film, you have a lot of visual effects. What was the DI process like, the digital intermediate process like? Who did you work with to make sure you got all this right? A lot of times when we talk these days about the DI, it's not as big a topic as it was, 5, 8, 10 years ago when we were first discussing it. And it's usually it's not part of the cinematography. It's often to tweak around the edges. But in this case, there's so much going on. What was that process like? Who'd you work with, and how'd you pull that off?
During the pre-production, I worked very closely with Harbor Picture Company. That's who the company I did the DI with. Matthew Tomlinson is a color scientist there, and he was the one who helped me out with all the lookup tables. And I even worked also with Philippe Panzini, who is at Codex, the company Codex in England, and he also helped designing these lookup tables because he is quite a fanatic on film stocks and all this sort of thing. So he did a heavy research into these emulsions, and the colorist was Ivan Luca, who works there at Harbor Picture Company, and I've done several movies with him in the past, and yeah, he worked with me from the beginning. Also helping creating these lookup tables as well, and then the DI indeed was pretty complex, but quite enjoyable. In the end, since we already had this work done previously with all the lookup tables, it was complex because of the amount of scenes and the all the different eras and all this. But the lookup tables helped a lot. In the end, we mostly treated the color timing kind of like photochemical timing, in the sense that we did primary grading, red, green, blue, and density, literally points of color, where we come into a scene and Ivan had already sort of matched the scene, and I would say, Ivan, I feel this whole scene should have 2 more points of red and 1 point of density. Boom, he'd apply it, and then that was it. And then sometimes we do some windows and things of this sort, secondary grading, but for the most part we kept it simple. What was interesting also is doing the HDR pass, for example, for Netflix. That was important. So that was based certainly on our first color grading. That was a P3 version for digital cinema. But then for monitors, for television, the HDR was really interesting to see, this very deep blacks and the possibility of having more detail in the highlights. And, it's like a new, whole different world. You have to be careful sometimes, because you can really have highlights that are really bright, and so we had to be careful to maintain the mood that we'd created in our digital cinema package, our DCP, and yet also utilize the possibilities that HDR gives you in terms of deep blacks and also detail in the shadows and detail in the highlights. So I found that version to be quite beautiful, and there are things that you can't see in the screen that are there on the monitor. We also did a version for Dolby Cinema, which is fantastic. That's my favorite version of it all. It's really, really beautiful. But so color timing has become much more involved these days, with all these different versions that you have to supervise, and indeed, it's a very important part of cinematography.
And we do have to wrap up, but I did have one final question, also about not so much the making of the film as the consequences of the film. I'm curious about your thoughts when the movie first arrived. There was some controversy not about its content, but about its release methodology, its platform, and it came out on the cinema screens. It quickly went to streaming on Netflix, which financed the entire project. And I believe, if memory serves, that led to some controversy at Cannes or some of the festivals about awards in general, and whether movies that are primarily going to be seen on the streaming platform should be eligible for cinema awards and consideration, all that kind of stuff. And yet, if you look at how the movie was made, and based on what you just have been telling us, it's a very sophisticated, high-end, and clearly cinematic project from beginning to end. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that controversy and just how these things should be judged now that we are in an era of multi-platforms. Should it be judged on where it's going to end up or shoot out to the public, or should it be judged on how it was made and how successful that was creatively to tell a story? It's kind of confusing.
It is. Well, for one, I'm very grateful to Netflix for having taken on this project, and I know Scorsese is too. And he said repeatedly that this movie would have not been made any other way. The other studios were not willing to take this risk, and Netflix did jump on it. And I must say that they did put it out on cinemas, and of course there was this hope that the negotiations with the theaters would lead to being able to have more cinemas. Of course, I won't get into that, but in the end, I know we all would have wanted the movie to be screened more widely and then more theaters. But I think that the fact that this movie was made the way it was made is fantastic, and I do think that streaming has given opportunities for many directors to do projects that perhaps would not be made for the cinema, and but these projects are being made and are being financed, and that's, I think, something that should be celebrated. In that sense, I think, film festivals and all the awards and all this stuff, I think the reason for these things to exist is to support filmmakers and to celebrate cinema. And I do think that content, a lot of the content that's been created for streaming services is very cinematic and artistic, and I do think should be included in the celebration of cinema. So, I don't know what's going to be in the end, but at least I think what matters is that there is this possibility for filmmakers to create their visions and tell the stories that they want to tell, either for exclusively for theaters and cinemas, but now there's a possibility of reaching big audiences in other ways through streaming. So I, for one, celebrated, and I'm very, very happy and grateful to Netflix for the opportunity that we all had to make this movie and for people to see it anytime.
Well, it certainly was a very impressive effort, and I know it's going strong. I wish you and Marty and the whole team a lot of luck with it, and I appreciate you taking time, Rodrigo, to talk to us about it today.
Thank you very much, Michael, and I'm very happy that you enjoyed the film, and I hope that anybody listening to this podcast, that if you haven't seen it, go take a look, and perhaps if you have seen it, maybe hearing a little bit about the way we made it makes the experience even more interesting.
And that was another Studio Daily podcast from the front lines. My conversation with cinematographer Rodrigo Prieto about his camera work on Martin Scorsese's latest film, The Irishman. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch your inbox every month for more newsletters directing you to our monthly podcasts covering the art, science, and people involved in the world of feature filmmaking. I'm Michael Goldman. Have a great day.